You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. Gods and Kings. Chronicles of the Kings.
Shortly after King Solomon's death in 931 B.C., the Promised Land split into two separate kingdoms. Israel, the larger nation to the north, set up its capital in Samaria and was no longer governed by a descendant of King David. In the southern nation of Judah, where this story takes place, David's royal line continued to rule from Jerusalem. This narrative centers on the lives of two kings of Judah, Ahaz, who ruled from 732 to 716 B.C., and his son Hezekiah, who ruled from 716 to 687 B.C. And now, Gods and Kings.
Chapter 2. The nightmare jolted Hezekiah awake. He had dreamed of Molech again, the image so vivid that he'd felt the heat of the flames. He lay awake in the darkness, breathing hard, his heart pounding until his chest hurt. He listened for soldiers and distant drums, but the palace hallways were quiet. It was just a bad dream, he told himself. But when he gazed at Eliab's bed, he knew that Molech was real. He hadn't been dreaming on that terrible morning when they'd taken Eliab and thrown him into the fire. What if the soldiers came back for him? It seemed to Hezekiah like a long time had passed since Eliab had died. Uncle Maaseiah and his soldiers had all marched away into battle. But what would happen when they returned? Hezekiah wondered if they would throw him into the monster's mouth the way they'd thrown Eliab. He remembered how the soldiers had picked him up as if he'd weighed nothing at all. He remembered their swords and spears. A shudder passed through his body that jolted him upright. He was helpless. The servants who slept nearby wouldn't save him. They hadn't saved Eliab. Only Mama had tried to stop the soldiers. She would protect him. Hezekiah climbed out of bed and ran down the darkened corridors to his mother's suite in the harem. Ever since Eliab died, she had allowed him to come and stay with her whenever he had a bad dream, and the nightmares had come nearly every night. Her door was unlatched. Hezekiah pushed it open and ran to her. "Mama! Mama! I'm scared!" he cried. She sat all alone on the cushioned window seat, gazing into the night sky, but she turned at the sound of his voice and reached to gather him into her arms. "Come here, my little one. Hush now. Don't cry." Mama was warm and soft and very beautiful. Her dark hair flowed down her back in thick waves and smelled like flowers and myrrh. Hezekiah felt safe here. She would keep the soldiers away. She would stop the nightmares from coming. In the comfort of her arms, with his cheek resting against her shoulder, Hezekiah closed his eyes and fell asleep. The sound of voices startled him awake. He cried out in fright, terrified that the soldiers had returned, but only his father stood alone in the doorway. He seemed huge to Hezekiah, his face scary in the flickering lamplight. Mama tightened her grip until Hezekiah could scarcely breathe. Her heart was beating as rapidly as his was. "What is that boy doing in here?" Ahaz asked. He was wheezing from his climb up the stairs to the harem, and his forehead glistened with sweat. "Good evening, my lord," Mama said, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't think you would come tonight. Your son had a bad dream. He came to be comforted, that's all." "Well, send him back to his room." Ahaz seemed so frightening that Hezekiah wished he could melt into his mother's arms. Instead, she slowly released him, lowering his feet to the floor as she stood. Then she tugged on his hand, urging him to bow down to Ahaz, as she was doing. "Your father is our king," she told him. "We must bow to show respect to his majesty." Hezekiah did as he was told. When he glanced up, his father looked pleased. "Your son Hezekiah is much like you, my lord," Mama said, resting her hands on Hezekiah's shoulders. He will make a fine choice to be your heir and successor one day." Ahaz crossed the room until he stood in front of them. Hezekiah's heart raced so wildly as his father studied him that he was afraid it would burst. He wanted to run and hide. "But you aren't my firstborn," Ahaz said. "I gave my firstborn as a gift to Molech." Hezekiah began to tremble as the awful truth sank in. It wasn't the soldiers he needed to fear. It was his father. He was the one who had ordered the soldiers to throw Eliab into the flames. And Ahaz had the power to kill him the same way. At last, Ahaz looked away. He loosened the belt of his tunic as he turned to Hezekiah's mother. "Didn't you hear me, Abijah? I said, send the boy away." "Of course, my lord." She smiled, but Hezekiah knew it wasn't her real smile. She looked so different that a chill shivered through him. Mama was afraid of King Ahaz, too, almost as afraid as he was. Hezekiah wriggled free and ran past his father, not stopping until he reached his own room. He slammed the door and leaned against it, as if to barricade himself inside. He felt sick with fear. His father had killed Eliab. The king was the most powerful person there was. Who could possibly protect Hezekiah from the king? He was wide awake now, every muscle and nerve ending tingling. Where could he hide? His mother's room was no longer safe. He was afraid to stay here, but terrified to leave. He stood frozen in place, wondering what to do. Gradually his eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, and his breathing slowed to normal. The corridors outside his room were quiet and still. As the familiar contours of his room began to take shape, the shadows seemed less menacing. He could distinguish the bronze lampstands against the wall, the ivory table beneath the window, the charcoal brazier glowing faintly, his rumpled, empty bed. And Eliab's. Tears filled his eyes and ran down his face as he remembered his brother. They had clothed Eliab in a tunic of white linen and forced him to walk in the procession to the valley of Hinnom, sleepy and bewildered. Their father, dressed in royal robes, had led that procession. He had offered his firstborn to Molech. But what Hezekiah didn't understand was why. Why had his father killed Eliab? Abijah moved forward into Ahaz's arms, desperate to hide her emotions from him. He seemed proud of what he had done, calling Eliab a gift to Molech. But Abijah remembered the holy laws her father had once taught, and those laws said that firstborn sons belonged to Yahweh. Their lives were to be redeemed with silver, not offered to idols. Yahweh wanted his children to serve him with their lives, not their deaths. But Abijah didn't dare speak such thoughts out loud. She leaned against her husband, forcing herself not to cry or yield to the grief that still consumed her. For Hezekiah's sake, she had to push aside her own revulsion as Ahaz's hands touched her. She must smile in spite of her pain. "Do I please you, my lord?" she murmured as she returned his caresses. "This is a good beginning," he said, bending to kiss her. She pretended to return his kisses, to act as if she enjoyed them. Then Ahaz stopped suddenly. "Why do you ask?" he said. Her heart began to pound. She was afraid that she had overacted and made him suspicious. Because I want so much to please you." She hoped he wouldn't see through her clumsy reply, and quickly added, "I know you have several concubines, but I'm your only wife. Perhaps I'm a little jealous of them?" Ahaz grinned, and she hated him more fiercely than she ever thought possible. She buried her face against his chest again to hide her loathing. "I want to be the one you come to each night," she said. "King David had a favored wife. I want to be yours." "Shall I call you Bathsheba, then?" he asked as he kissed her neck. She pretended to laugh. "If you'd like to, my lord." Abijah knew that David had chosen Bathsheba's son to be his heir, even though Solomon wasn't his firstborn. If she could win Ahaz's favor above all the other women in his harem, if she was the one he came to for comfort and solace, she could ask him to designate Hezekiah as his heir some day. She loved her son enough to do that for him, to save him from Molech, even though she would have to sacrifice her own pride and dignity in order to do it. This first night would be the most difficult, she told herself, coming so soon after Eliab's death. Maybe in time she would learn how to close off her mind and pretend she was somewhere else whenever Ahaz came to her. Maybe in time she would no longer be repulsed by him every time she held him. Abijah drew a deep breath and played her part, determined to do everything in her power to please Ahaz, for her son's sake. But when someone interrupted them, pounding insistently on the door, Abijah felt immensely relieved. "Who is it?" Ahaz shouted. "Your Majesty, please forgive me for disturbing you," one of the chamberlains said from behind the closed door, "but a messenger just arrived with news of your army." Abijah felt Ahaz grow tense. She looked up at him and saw his undisguised fear. She thought of Eliab and felt no pity for him. "Just a minute," Ahaz called as he composed himself. Abijah followed him as he crossed the room and opened the door. The chamberlain who waited outside looked very worried. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I never would have interrupted you if it hadn't been so urgent." "What's the news?" It's not good, I'm afraid. And there are 2 other reports that I think you should see." Ahaz turned to Abijah, and she saw how unsure of himself he was. He wanted to escape into her arms, not handle this crisis. She knew then that her plan to win his confidence would work. She could take advantage of his weakness and use her charms to influence him. If she could just push aside her revulsion and pretend that she loved him, she could find out what this crisis was about and what his plans were. Because if he was going to offer another sacrifice to Molech, she needed to hide Hezekiah from him. She reached up to caress her husband's neck. "If you would like, my lord, I will gladly come and wait in your chambers until the meeting ends." His eyebrows lifted in surprise. His face wore a vulnerable expression that she'd never seen before, as if her offer had touched him. Ahaz had always come to her rooms. She had never offered to go to his before. "I would like that very much," he said. He smoothed his thin, pale hair into place and wiped the beads of sweat from his forehead. Then he turned to his chamberlain. "Why does disaster always strike in the middle of the night?" he asked as they left together. "I don't know, Your Majesty." Abijah closed the door behind them, and their voices faded as they hurried away. She felt filthy for play-acting with him, for allowing her son's murderer to caress her, and she fought the urge to take a bath. This was just the first of many nights she would be forced to spend with him, and she wondered if she would ever get used to being with a man she despised. She sat down on the curtained bed for a moment and allowed the tears she had been holding back to flow. When they were finally spent, she dried her eyes and steeled herself to go downstairs. She would wait for Ahaz in his bedchamber. Hezekiah stood by his door for a very long time, listening to every sound, a cricket chirping in the courtyard below his window, an owl hooting softly in the valley near the spring, a shutter creaking as the wind blew past his window. Before long the night sounds merged into a comforting rhythm, and his legs grew weary, his eyes heavy with sleep. He was about to climb back into bed when he saw torchlight dancing through the crack under his door. Someone hurried down the hallway toward his room. then past it. Hezekiah opened the door a crack and peered out. He heard insistent pounding and urgent voices around the corner by his mother's room. He listened, ready to run, his heart thumping in his chest. A moment later the light grew brighter as the man with the torch moved down the hall toward him again. He saw his father rounding the corner with a palace chamberlain. "I've summoned your advisers to the council chamber," the servant was saying. "You'll have a few minutes to read the reports for yourself before the counselors arrive." Hezekiah stared through the narrow crack as his father hurried past. "What about my brother?" Ahaz asked. "Did the messenger say where Maaseiah is?" Hezekiah didn't hear the reply. The voices grew faint as the men disappeared down the stairs. He stood shivering in the darkness, the floor cold beneath his bare feet. Why was his father asking about Uncle Maaseiah? Hezekiah stepped out into the hallway. For a moment he considered running back to the safety of his mother's room. But then a great need, the need to understand why his father had sacrificed Eliab to Molech, overshadowed his wish for comfort. He crept down the stairs, following Ahaz to the council chamber. A heavy curtain guarded the service entrance to the chamber, and Hezekiah slid past it, hiding in the anteroom where the servants usually waited to be summoned. The tiny room was empty, so he crouched behind a pillar and peered into the council room. His father's throne stood on a raised dais at one end of the room, with Uncle Maaseiah's empty seat beside it. Thick wool carpets and cushions were arranged in front of the dais for the king's advisers, and a servant scurried between them, lighting lamps and charcoal braziers. The room seemed gloomy, even with all of the lamps lit. When the servant finished, he left the council chamber, hurrying past Hezekiah without seeing him. King Ahaz stood beneath a lampstand, reading from a scroll, his lips drawn into a thin line. Hezekiah heard him moan, and the parchment dropped to the floor as Ahaz tore the front of his robes. "I never should have let him go into battle," he cried out. "How can I run this nation without Maaseiah?" He gazed up at the thick cedar beams as if the answer to his question was written up there. "Why don't you sit down, Your Majesty? You're upset." The chamberlain took Ahaz's arm and led him to his throne. "You've suffered a great shock, but your counselors are coming now. They'll know what to do." Ahaz dropped into his chair as his advisers began hurrying into the room. They appeared groggy and confused, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. "Is it news of your army, Your Majesty?" someone asked. Hezekiah stiffened, suddenly alert. He remembered the endless rows of soldiers that had lined up in the palace courtyard and forced him to walk down the hill to the Hinnom Valley. They had carried him up the steps to the monster's platform, then surrounded it so that he and Eliab couldn't escape. His father's army. King Ahaz lifted a wine goblet from the ivory table beside his throne and took 2 quick gulps, then wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Yes, disastrous news," he replied. "The army that I sent north to stop the invasion has been defeated. 120,000 soldiers have been slaughtered. My 3 commanders, Azrikam, Elkanah, my brother Maaseiah." He gestured to the empty seat beside his as his voice choked. The room grew so still that Hezekiah could hear the oil lamps hissing faintly as they burned, casting wavering shadows on the walls. "All 3 men are dead," Ahaz said at last. He reached for the wine-glass again and gulped 2 more mouthfuls. "The enemy alliance proved stronger than we thought. I've lost most of my army, and the invaders are still marching south, overrunning every village and town in their path. They've taken more than 200,000 people captive." Hezekiah heard several of the advisers moan. Ahaz gulped another drink, then gripped the arms of his throne as if to steady himself. "The enemy is heading here. They're going to attack Jerusalem. and try to overthrow my government." Everyone started talking at once, as a ripple of fear coursed through the room. When the shockwave reached Hezekiah, he began to shiver. He crouched lower in the shadows. Ahaz drained his glass, then shouted, "Shut up and listen to me! There's more!" Instantly the room fell silent. "I've had news from the south as well. The king of Edom has taken advantage of this crisis to invade our only seaport. Elath is lost." Once again the meeting dissolved into chaos, and once again Ahaz shouted the men into silence. "There's still more! Our old enemies, the Philistines, have come against us too. They've raided towns in the foothills and the Negev, and have already captured Beth-Shemesh, Ajalon, Timnah, 3 or 4 others I can't remember." The men stared at Ahaz as if unable to believe what he was telling them. "We're being attacked on 3 sides?" someone asked. "Yes." Hezekiah didn't understand what was going on, but he could tell by the tense murmuring that these men were afraid. He listened breathlessly. "What are we going to do?" another man asked. "For the time being, we'll have to forget about the Edomites and the Philistines," Ahaz said. "Our most serious threat is from the Northern Alliance. The Aramean army will reach Jerusalem within a few days. They're organized and powerful, and we have very few soldiers left. So, you tell me, what are we going to do?" He gazed at his advisers for several long moments, but none of them replied. Ahaz's voice rose to a shout. "Doesn't anyone have a word of advice?" A nobleman seated near the front finally stood. "Your Majesty, if Jerusalem is facing a lengthy siege, we must consider our water resources." The man wore several gold rings on his fingers, and whenever he gestured, Hezekiah saw a pattern like fireflies on the ceiling above his head. "The rainy season is still months away," the man continued, "and the city's cisterns are getting low. Is there any way we can defend the Gihon spring? Otherwise, once we seal the city gates, we'll be cut off from our water supply." "I know perfectly well where the spring is," Ahaz shouted. "Everyone in Jerusalem knows that we don't have any fresh water inside our walls. But what can we possibly do about it now? The enemy will be here in a matter of days." He glared at the man as if challenging him to answer. He shrugged and sat down. "So, he has no advice for me," Ahaz said. "Do any of the rest of you?" From the back of the room, almost against the rear wall, a lone figure rose to his feet. "I do, Your Majesty." "Who are you? Come forward where I can see you." "I'm Uriah, High Priest of the Temple of Yahweh." He spoke in a deep, clear voice, and unlike Ahaz's other advisers, he appeared calm. He was tall and powerfully built, and he strode forward with such a commanding presence that Hezekiah curled up in the shadows where he was crouching, suddenly afraid. He couldn't help comparing the high priest to Ahaz, and the king came up short on every point. Uriah had muscular shoulders and a broad chest, but Ahaz was flabby and round-shouldered, with no muscles beneath the fat. Uriah's black hair and beard looked full and thick, while the soft reddish hair on Ahaz's face formed only a scraggly beard. The priest seemed to have no wasted motion, his every gesture sure and powerful, while Ahaz's hands fluttered and fidgeted nervously. Hezekiah was surprised to see his father lean forward in his seat, as if in awe of the tall priest. "You have permission to speak, Uriah." "Your Majesty, our nation needs a strong ally to come to our defense in this crisis. I suggest that we quickly approach one of our neighboring nations for help."
"An excellent suggestion," Ahaz said, settling back on his throne again. "Now the question is, which nation would be most likely to help us?"
"I've given it a great deal of thought," Uriah began, but Ahaz cut him off.
"Which nation does our enemy fear the most? I want to choose an ally that will fill the Arameans' hearts with dread."
"Your Majesty, it might be better if we—"
"I want an ally that will make them retreat out of Judah as soon as they hear the news of our alliance. Which nation would do that?"
The man with the many rings rose to his feet again. "Your Majesty, the Assyrians are the Arameans' greatest threat. The Assyrian Empire is already vast and far-reaching, and I'm sure the king of Aram fears becoming the next target of their aggression."
"Perfect," Ahaz shouted. "Would the Assyrians be willing to ally themselves with us?" he asked Uriah.
"An alliance with us would certainly give them a foothold in this region, which is what they're looking for," Uriah replied. "But I think we should consider a less dangerous ally first. The Assyrians are a vicious, violent, bloodthirsty nation, and I think it would be a mistake to ask them to—"
"Good! The more bloodthirsty the better," Ahaz said. "I want the men who killed my brother to suffer."
His words jolted Hezekiah. He wanted to punish the man who killed his brother, too. But how? The man responsible was his father, the king.
"Uriah's right," Ahaz continued. "We must convince another nation to come to our defense. We are in no position to defend ourselves without an army. The stronger that ally is, the better."
He drew a deep breath.
"We'll send a gift of tribute to Assyria and propose an alliance. This gift must be very lavish in order to convince them that we are a worthy ally. We'll need to send gold, silver, precious stones, and we'll need to act quickly before the enemy lays siege to Jerusalem."
"But, Your Majesty," someone protested, "where will this gift come from? There's no time to levy taxes, and we've already emptied the royal treasuries to equip Maaseiah's army." King Ahaz glanced all around the room, as if hoping that bars of gold would magically appear. Then his eyes fell on the high priest, still standing in front of him.
"Uriah, you will remove the gold and other valuables from the Temple of Solomon."
Uriah looked distressed by Ahaz's plan. "But, Your Majesty, the temple storehouses are nearly empty. The only valuables remaining are the sacred vessels that are used for worship. It's true that the Holy of Holies contains a wealth of gold, but it is part of the structure. There's no way to remove it without permanently damaging Yahweh's dwelling place." King Ahaz didn't appear to be listening.
"A wealth of gold," he repeated. "I'm favorably impressed with your wisdom and counsel, Uriah. I'm putting you in charge of the gift to Assyria. If you do well, you will be the new palace administrator in my brother's place."
He gestured to the empty seat at his right-hand side.
"Tear the temple down if necessary, but this gift must be acceptable to the Assyrians."
Uriah nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Your Majesty."
"When everything is ready, I will send a delegation to the Assyrian monarch, along with my personal appeal for a covenant with his nation."
Ahaz looked confident for the first time that night. He rose from his chair and began issuing orders, gesturing to his advisers.
"We'll need to raise another army for the defense of Jerusalem. You three are in charge of that. As for the rest of you, begin spreading word of the coming siege as soon as you're dismissed. Make sure the city and surrounding areas are prepared as quickly as possible. It may take some time for our new Assyrian allies to rally to our defense."
The task of making so many decisions seemed to exhaust Ahaz. He sank onto his throne again when he was finished.
"That's all we can do for now. You're dismissed. Where's my servant?
Hezekiah didn't move aside in time, and Ahaz's servant nearly tripped over him as he rushed into the anteroom to attend to the king. "What are you doing here?" the man asked. He grabbed Hezekiah by the shoulders. "You don't belong in here." "Let me go," Hezekiah said as he struggled to break free. He needed to run upstairs and hide before his father saw him. But Ahaz had already heard the commotion.
"What's going on over there?" he asked. "Where's my servant?"
"I'm here, Your Majesty. I'm coming. Forgive me." He carried Hezekiah, still struggling, into the council room. "I found this boy in the antechamber. I don't know how—"
"You again! What are you doing down here?"
Ahaz demanded. Hezekiah couldn't speak. He wanted to rush forward and strike his father for killing Eliab, but he couldn't seem to move. As he gazed up at Ahaz, a terrible darkness began building deep inside Hezekiah, growing moment by moment like a powerful storm. He was terrified of his father. That was certainly part of it. But this new feeling was much bigger, much more overwhelming than fear. It was hatred.
"Why are you looking at me like that?"
Ahaz asked.
"Get him out of here!"
The servant picked Hezekiah up and hustled him from the room. During the brief disturbance with the king's son, Uriah had time to refocus his thoughts. He had been too astounded by his sudden promotion to palace administrator to think clearly a moment ago. Now that the boy was gone, he strode to the front again. "One moment, please, Your Majesty. I'd like to make one further suggestion."
"What is it?"
"I'd like to advise you to include a public sacrifice to Yahweh in your plans, my lord. We will need divine help in this crisis." Ahaz sat up straight.
"Another excellent suggestion, Uriah. I'm impressed with your wisdom. However—"
Ahaz gathered the sparse whiskers of his beard together, looking thoughtful. Uriah heard the hesitation in the king's voice as he paused.
"However, I don't think it would be appropriate to sacrifice to Yahweh after emptying his temple's storehouses," he finally said. "I'm uneasy about that. Surely you understand." "No, we've already sought the help of Molech, the most powerful of all the gods. He won't desert us now, especially after I've personally sacrificed so much. So before the siege begins, we will hold another sacrifice to Molech."
Uriah's stomach turned over in horror at what he'd unwittingly initiated. He searched for a way to argue with Ahaz, to contradict him, but came up blank. Only a fool questioned the king's decisions. Ahaz turned to the rest of his milling advisers, challenging them.
"Perhaps those of you who withheld your sons from Molech the last time will consider the great danger this nation is in. We need Molech's great power in this crisis, and so we all must sacrifice a son this time. He's a demanding god, but surely we can father a dozen sons once Molech saves us from destruction."
Uriah reeled in shock at the king's words. Ahaz planned to kill another son, another of Abijah's children. As high priest, Uriah was sworn to fight against idolatry, not promote it. How had his advice to the king gotten so out of control?
"The sacrifice to Molech must take place as soon as possible, before the siege begins," Ahaz continued. He turned to Uriah. "I will leave all the preparations for it in your hands."
Uriah felt all the blood drain from his face as he stared at Ahaz. For a long moment he was unable to speak. When he finally did, his voice didn't sound like his own. I'm a priest of Yahweh, Your Majesty, not Molech."
"You're the new palace administrator," Ahaz thundered, gesturing to his brother's empty chair. "Unless you don't want the job?"
Uriah stopped breathing. He had mere seconds to make the biggest decision of his life, a decision that would set the course of his future. He could sit at the king's right-hand side, or he could refuse. "Of course, Your Majesty," he finally said, bowing slightly. "As you wish."
"Good. Then you're dismissed."
It took an enormous effort for Uriah to walk from the room on his trembling legs. Several of the other advisers tried to speak with him, to congratulate him as he left the council chamber, but he moved past them like a blind man. He needed to get out of the palace and find a place to sit down and think. Moving on instinct, he headed up the hill to the temple. Dawn was only an hour or two away, judging by the fading stars in the eastern sky. He needed to assimilate everything that had just happened before his many responsibilities as high priest crowded out all his other thoughts. He crossed the deserted outer courtyard and sank down on one of the steps that led to the inner court. The stones felt colder than the night air as he leaned against them. It had been an astounding meeting. Uriah had seized the opportunity of Prince Maasiah's death to catapult himself from the back row of the council chamber to the king's right-hand side. He had suddenly attained a position of enormous power in the nation, power he had worked hard to claim for over 18 years. He should be overjoyed. Yet a gnawing unrest filled Uriah's soul as he thought of the price he would pay for that power. He would have to desecrate Solomon's temple, plundering its gold for the Assyrian tribute. He dreaded being responsible for that destruction, but he knew that King Ahaz would take whatever gold he wanted, whether Uriah approved or not. At least he could try to hold the damage to a minimum. No, the root of his unrest was the sacrifice to Molech. Uriah was Yahweh's high priest. How could he deliberately take part in idol worship? Yet if he refused to preside over the sacrifice, he would forfeit his new position as palace administrator. Once again he would be a powerless priest in the crumbling temple of Yahweh, struggling to scratch out a living from meager offerings. One of Molech's priests would gladly do the king's bidding, and he would be the one to gain preeminence as high priest of the nation. Uriah clenched his fists. Never. He would fight for what was rightfully his. Yahweh was the only God of Israel, and all the power belonged to his high priest, not Molech's. Uriah determined to do whatever needed to be done. After all, the palace administrator merely made all the arrangements for the sacrifice. He wouldn't have to officiate. Uriah looked up at the holy sanctuary looming above him in the darkness. The white stones appeared solid and substantial from where he sat in their shadows, but he knew that daylight would quickly reveal the truth of how badly the structure had deteriorated over the years. In its prime, Yahweh's temple had been the pride of his nation, but now it stood forlorn, like a deposed queen, clothed in the remnants of her former glory. Uriah shook his head, as if to erase the pitiful sight. Ever since he'd inherited the priesthood, he'd watched helplessly as the institution that he served decayed from apathy. His countrymen had neglected the Lord's temple and the required tithes and offerings for so many years that the priests and Levites could barely make a living, much less afford repairs to the building. Most of his brethren had deserted Jerusalem long ago, ignoring their regular terms of duty to pursue other means of supporting their families. Meanwhile, the worship of Yahweh had become stagnant, stuck in a routine of traditions and rituals that no longer had meaning for the people. Yet the priests and Levites who remained were opposed to change. Uriah had deliberately pursued a position of power in King Ahaz's court, vowing to restore the temple of Yahweh to its rightful place of authority in the nation. He had sat in the back row of the council chamber for nearly 2 years, watching for an opening, waiting for his chance at power. Now it had come. The only obstacle in his path was the sacrifice to Molech. He sat on the cold step for a long time, watching the eastern sky grow lighter and lighter. When the sun finally peaked above the Mount of Olives, he shaded his eyes from it. He would have to leave soon. The priests and Levites would be arriving to begin their preparations for the morning sacrifice. But Uriah couldn't seem to move. As a man of God, he knew that he should pray about a decision as big as this one, and he found it odd that he hadn't, that he couldn't. The longer Uriah sat, the more he longed for someone to confide in, someone who could appreciate the opportunity that King Ahaz had offered him and help put his conscience to rest. He thought of Zechariah the Levite. His former teacher and mentor was a brilliant man, well versed in the minutest letter of the law. He was also an astute politician, setting the example Uriah had followed in pursuing political power. And although Zechariah had lost his position in court after King Uzziah died, Uriah felt drawn to him now. Zechariah was one of the few men who could understand the dilemma that Uriah faced and offer him advice. He slowly rose to his feet, his body stiff with cold, and walked around the courtyard to the rusting door that led to the Levites' quarters. He paused in the dim corridor outside Zechariah's room. Seeing his former teacher always brought back memories of Abijah, and with those memories, a sense of hopeless frustration. Uriah had always known that she couldn't belong to him, but that knowledge hadn't stopped him from wanting her. He had loved Abijah since the first day he'd seen her, the first day he'd become her father's pupil. And his love for her was the only thing in his life that he'd never been able to control. He loved her still, the king's wife. Uriah finally forced Abijah from his mind and rapped on her father's door. While he waited, he thought of all the changes in his mentor's life, how Zechariah had fallen from political power, how he'd lost his home, his wife, his health. When no one answered the door, Uriah realized that he hadn't seen Zechariah in months. He nearly turned away, then decided to knock one more time.
"Go away," Zechariah called from inside. "Leave me alone."
Uriah stared at the closed door. He had put on a show of great self-confidence before the king a short time ago, but he suddenly felt inadequate before the man he had always admired and sought to emulate.
"Rabbi Zechariah, it's me, Uriah. May I have a word with you, please?"
Several minutes passed before Zechariah opened the door. He looked confused, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, his robes rumpled and sour-smelling, as if he'd slept in them. Uriah nearly turned away a second time. This couldn't be the respected Levite, the man who had once sat at the king's right hand. But it was. The man Uriah remembered was tall and lean and strong. But now Zechariah's shoulders stooped, as if bearing a heavy load. The spark of intelligence had vanished from his distinguished face and green eyes, and his pale features looked drained of life. He was barely 55, but his unkempt hair and beard made him appear much older.
"Uriah, come in, Zechariah stammered. He led the way into the room, staggering slightly, and cleared a place in the clutter for Uriah to sit.
"I'm sorry if I've disturbed you," Uriah began, "but I need to talk to you." He struggled to conceal his shock at the change in Zechariah. He could barely remember why he had come.
"I'll get some wine," Zechariah said.
He tottered over to a shelf and produced a skin of wine and 2 goblets. Uriah winced with embarrassment.
No, thank you, Rabbi. It's too early for me. But please, you go ahead."
He felt ashamed for Zechariah. Coming here had been a mistake. Uriah stared at the floor, groping for words, wishing he could leave. Zechariah took a few quick gulps from the wineskin. Then, with a pathetic remnant of his former dignity, he pulled up a stool and sat opposite Uriah.
What did you need to talk to me about?
Uriah saw the respected teacher he had come to seek as if through a dingy curtain. He cleared his throat.
Rabbi, I have just come from a meeting with King Ahaz. I wanted you to be the first to know. I've been appointed palace administrator. But what about Prince Garcia?
Our army has been defeated. We've suffered enormous losses. The prince is dead.
It's a great honor for you, but Prince Garcia,
Zechariah's confusion didn't seem to be caused by the news. His gaze darted all around the room as if he wasn't quite sure where he was. I want to accept this position, Rabbi. It's an extraordinary opportunity. But it would mean... Uriah couldn't bring himself to admit that it would mean idolatry. He realized suddenly that he hadn't come for Zechariah's help in making a decision. Uriah had made his decision in the council chamber, the moment Ahaz had offered him the prince's empty seat. He had come to win Zechariah's approval, as if his former teacher could somehow absolve him from guilt.
It's just that some of my duties as palace administrator may go against the teachings of the Torah, Uriah explained. But if I use this opportunity to establish myself as a close advisor to the king, I will be in a position to teach King Ahaz about Yahweh's law. And ultimately, I can do a great deal of good.
He leaned forward on the edge of his seat, almost pleading for Zechariah's approval. All my life, all my ambition and striving has been with one goal in mind: to revive the role of the priesthood and make the temple an influential force in this nation again. Now, I can do that. I've worked my way up from the bottom, waiting for an opportunity like this. I'll be second in command to the king. Zechariah stared at him blankly, as if wondering where he fit in.
I know there are some priests and Levites who will object to what I'm doing, Uriah quickly continued, and I'll need your help in winning them over. You're a man of influence here in the temple. Surely you can understand what I'm trying to accomplish. You once held the same position in the palace, and you...
Uriah stopped, keenly embarrassed for reminding this broken, disheveled man of the power and position he had once held and lost.
I just wanted to ask if I could have your support, he finished. My support, Zechariah echoed. He stared at Uriah for a moment, then a faint smile flickered briefly across his face. Yes, Rabbi, please support me in this. If I make a few concessions to Ahaz in order to gain his confidence, I can begin to teach him Yahweh's law, the way you once taught King Uzziah. Zechariah's head jerked backward at the mention of Uzziah, as if Uriah had slapped him. Zechariah stared at him with watery eyes, then stood and shuffled to the shelf to retrieve the wineskin. You're going to teach Ahaz? Make him stop his idolatry? He asked with his back turned. Uriah winced. It may take some time, Rabbi, but that's what I hope to accomplish. Eventually. Zechariah raised the wineskin to his lips and swallowed, then wiped his mouth with his fist. Uriah waited. You've always had more ambition than any of the others, Zechariah said at last. I won't oppose you if you decide to accept the position. His voice carried no enthusiasm. Thank you, Rabbi. Uriah stood and inched toward the door, eager to leave. There are several announcements from the king that I need to discuss with the chief priests and Levites. So I'm calling for a meeting at noon today. If you'll contact the chief Levites, I'll notify the chief priests.
Zechariah nodded but didn't face him.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shalom.
Uriah hurried from the room, closing the door quickly. His mentor's pathetic state had unnerved him, and he struggled to regain his composure as he wandered down the corridor. When he finally emerged into the sunlight again, he stopped, closing his eyes to summon the image of himself that he had so carefully practiced, the one he had successfully portrayed before the king, the erect posture, the controlled gestures, the intimidating stare of a man of authority. Then he willed his body to conform to that image. Once he felt outwardly in control, Uriah battled to untangle his conflicting thoughts and feelings. He couldn't imagine how a man as great as Zechariah had ended up in such a state. But now that Uriah had a chance to be as influential in the nation as Zechariah had once been, he was determined not to let the opportunity pass, even if it meant temporarily violating the Torah. A nagging voice tried to remind him of the price he would pay for disobeying the law, but Uriah chose to ignore the voice. Yahweh's temple would regain the power and glory it once enjoyed in the days of King Solomon. Uriah would not let this institution crumble into obscurity. He would not.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.